Welcome back to the political correction. Russia has denied claims that it is planning an invasion of Ukraine, despite having moved 100,000 of its troops to the border.
The international community has condemned the move, with Foreign Secretary Liz Truss had this warning to Russia.
They claim they want stability while they work to threaten and destabilise others. We know what lies down that path and the terrible toll in lives lost and human suffering it brings. That's why we urge President Putin to desist and step back from Ukraine before he makes a massive strategic mistake.
Earlier this week, the United States' Secretary of State Antony Blinken said if Russian military forces move across Ukraine's border, it will be met with a swift, severe and united response. Well, let's hope that that would be the case, but I wonder whether Vladimir Putin hasn't already achieved quite a lot of what he wanted. I'm very struck by this article in the Telegraph today. The EU's deafening silence on Russian aggression makes war more likely. Now, that is written by Tom Tugendhat, MP, who is the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, who was a Remainer, of course. But the point that he is making is that because Germany appears to have been blackmailed by receiving gas supplies from Russia and is opposing even the onward sale of NATO weapons to Ukraine, because France seems determined to strike a distinctive posture from the United States, whatever that might be, he thinks that this hesitancy has actually made war more likely. I'm not sure about that, but what I would say is that Vladimir Putin must be absolutely delighted to see the NATO allies striking different postures, and many of them pretty unimpressive. That's without even talking about President Biden's terrible gaffe the other day when he appeared to suggest that an incursion would be tolerated. Well,
I think it was a minor incursion, but then what does that mean? Does that mean you only come in at 20 miles, 30 miles, take over one city, two cities? It was a dreadful statement. And then his own spokespeople spent the whole of the rest of the week trying to backpedal from what that meant. And Antony Blinken, as you know, was over in Geneva having those talks with the Russians. And I understand Ben Wallace is going to continue with that. And actually, I think Ben Wallace has been a very good defence secretary in everything that he has been doing around Russia. How do you think our own government has reacted?
Well, I think there's a mainstream narrative here which is slightly concerning, which depicts Putin, who is unquestionably a tyrant, but in this situation as the would-be aggressor, champion at the bit to invade Ukraine, and NATO and the West, the US and the UK as the good guys. But I think there's an argument to say that in many cases what Putin has been doing is reacting to what he sees as a threat. You know, the sort of relentless expansion of NATO eastwards, Ukraine obviously on the border of Russia, NATO manoeuvres in the Black Sea and in western Ukraine, the Ukrainian government being armed by the UK and the US. I just wonder if, for example, if America found that Russian missiles were being based in Mexico. Look back to Cuba, for example, in 1962, when Soviet missiles, the plan was to locate Soviet missiles on Cuba. The Americans probably understandably went mad because they saw it as a threat. So yes, of course, countries are sovereign, but countries are not islands in the metaphorical sense. You know, there's a huge geopolitical game being played, and I fear that we're stoking up the situation unnecessarily.
I don't know whether your analogy with Cuba is exact, but would you, if you were making NATO foreign policy, would you accept a Russian sphere of influence that covered Ukraine?
Well, I don't think it's a question of whether you accept it. I think that it's a geopolitical reality, Michael. You know, we live in a world where countries like Russia and China and the US will try to exert force, whether economic or military, beyond their own borders. Now, we're not in a Cold War. The modern-day Russia has no power, in my view, nothing like the power of the old Soviet Union. It's conceded enormous amounts of territory over the last kind of 30 years. And it seems to me almost as if we're creating an enemy unnecessarily. And that's not, as I say, to downplay the tyranny of the Russian regime. But we were told, for example, when Trump was elected that Russia was behind it. Turned out that was nonsense. When we voted for Brexit, we were told Russia was behind it. Turns out it was nonsense. I suspect that this suggestion that they're about to invade Ukraine will turn out to be nonsense as well.
Well, we're now joined by Valery Morozov. He's a former Kremlin whistleblower and he's now a Russian analyst. Of course, we want to hear what you have to say, Valery. We're talking about this discussion, but what way do you read what's happening at the moment?
I think that what is going on, especially around Ukraine, is the cover-up of the really important negotiations and talks which are going inside, deep, mainly between the United States, Russia, and maybe China. And China, not maybe India. At least Putin wants India to be involved. And of course, in any case, in the nearest future, there will be no invasion unless Putin is forced, by different circumstances. But let us just take, say, for example, 100,000 troops, which are a lot of noise and a lot of talks is going on. Actually, the length of the Russian-Ukrainian border is nearly 2,500 kilometers. That is approximately from Moscow to London.
Yeah.
Also, it is included the Belarusian-Ukrainian border. It is 1,100 kilometers. This is from London or Moscow to Berlin. On this length, you are saying that there is 100,000 troops. That is in the depth of 400 kilometers. That is calculated inside Russian territory. That is 20 soldiers for 1 kilometer of the border or 400 square kilometers of the Russian territory. 10 soldiers.
You make the point well, but presumably the operation would not be to take over all of Ukraine. I believe Ukraine is the second largest country in Europe after Russia. It would be an operation of the sort we've already seen. We've seen Crimea go. Yeah. We've seen Donbass go to Russian-backed forces. It would be an incursion of that sort. But are you saying they're simply not going to do it? I can imagine that they would get very badly bogged down in a war against such a large country, and a country where I think quite a lot of people are determined to maintain their independence. So I can see that the prospect of such a war
we have to look at the facts. Last year, the trade turnover between Russia and Ukraine increased by approximately 70%, including fuel, petrol, diesel. That is what is coming to Ukraine. And that is what is used by the Ukrainian army, by Ukrainian civilians, their private cars and all those things. Russia is exporting electricity through Belarus. Russia is one of the main, and Belarus are one of the main partners, trade partners, and it is increased. Say, for example, the same fuel, there's more than 80% increased in the last year. What is the purpose of invading if you can stop simply supplying electricity and fuel? In Ukraine now, it is from -5 to -20. Let us just imagine if Putin decides to stop it.
Sure.
There will be the living standard in Ukraine is 3 times lower than in Russia. A lot of opposition.
Tell us about this global idea that Putin has to involve the United States, Russia, China, and maybe India. What is the settlement that he wants to see?
I think it is not even Putin. Putin is reacting. I think this is the idea of Biden. At least the initiative was from Biden. And for the first time when they met in Geneva, I think they discussed it. Actually, this is new architecture of international relations. And on the top of this architecture, there will be at least three, the United States, Russia, and China. Putin went to India. They signed a huge agreement with India. And now there is a big game, a great game. Who will be, how it will be distributed, how the world will be, where it will be, Europe also. Of course, the problem with Europe is that it has no military power, and compared to Russia or the United States.
Valery, would there be support in Russia among the people, the citizens, for any invasion of Ukraine?
No. And there is no support in Kremlin, and there is no idea. Russians understand that Ukraine is going to collapse by itself. economically and politically. And time is playing for Russians. And Putin just wants a certain moment, how he'll use his, all these levers to speed up the collapse or take over control, but he will not take over control by military invasion. That will be the last result. Actually, you should understand from the beginning, the collapse of the Soviet Union was initiated by Russia. And that is the only one party which was for this. And in 1947, the people who were actually the closed allies of, and not supporters, but, favorites of Stalin were arrested and executed. And the criminal case at that time was called the Russian case. It was the first attempt after the war to stop donating by Russia, to stop donating these republics, and let them go separately or whatever. That was the idea, a sort of Finlandization. At that time, Stalin arrested, executed, including Kuznetsov, for example, who was, or it was called also Leningrad Group. They were coming from, with the war. They were leaders during the war of the Leningrad and the Leningrad siege, very popular, heroic people. But they were arrested and executed. So these ideas were developing still in Russia. And that was the ideas which came in beginning of 1980s. I knew these people who were behind this.
Coming to today, do you think that NATO, the United States, can accept something that Putin will put on the table, his idea of a new global arrangement?
I think yes, because that is the whole purpose of this talk around Ukraine, because actually Russia is not asking for Ukraine. Russia is asking to take out the bases from the Eastern Europe, not Ukraine. Russia is asking to take the United States to remove nuclear weapons from Europe. It has nothing to do with Ukraine. These were the main demands of Putin now. But the talk actually is only about Ukraine, where Putin doesn't want to invade. He doesn't want to get problems.
Rather backing up Paul's point that we need to look at what NATO and the United States have been doing as well. But I think it will be very, very difficult for the United States to accept an idea of spheres of influence, which I think is probably implicit in the Putin grand plan that you describe.
Yeah, and it's really good to have your take on it, Valery, as well, because we've been hearing a lot about Putin and what he's thinking and wanting to go back to 1917 Russia and all of these sorts of things. So thank you so much for coming in and giving us your perspective.
Well,
Thank
welcome.
you. Thank you.